week, we are speaking with Yamini Sharma. She is the Director of Change Management at her organization. And today we are talking about how to make our project efforts impactful. So, Yamini, thank you so much for taking time out your schedule to be with us today and have this conversation.
Sure, happy to be here.
Yep. So, Yamini, just to start it off, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So my entire career has been mostly in change management. I started off in instructional design. Then I moved to work with Accenture, which is a very big consulting company, and I worked for them for a while. Left them to do an MBA, and since then I've been working in the field of change management. Mostly doing system implementations, large-scale global transformations. For the past 3 years, I've been focused on finance transformation in my current role, which is, working with corporate finance. So that's my focus. But yeah, pretty much been in the space of change management training, and also sort of focusing on ERP implementations a lot. I've worked on a lot of SAP projects, so that's definitely one area where I have a lot of expertise. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, you're the right person to have this conversation with. We just, we did the change management trend survey in February-March timeframe, and it turns out majority of change management practitioners are working on technology initiatives. So this is a very, I think, timely conversation. So when we talk about like making the project impactful, we're talking about the activity around the change impact assessment. But before we go deep into that, let's talk about the change management process. So from your perspective, even at a high level, kind of walk us through the typical change management process.
Yeah, so I'll take a simple, life cycle of just saying, you start by preparing for change, which is depending on the type of project, whether it's a technology implementation, whether it's a, process you're changing, whether it's a behavior change, a culture change, there's different kinds of projects. Technology implementations are where we typically end up engaging change managers because, a lot of times smaller projects don't have budgets. That we start by preparing for change, which is doing activities like audience analysis, stakeholder analysis, change impact assessment, training needs analysis, so on and so forth. You do all these analysis. The next phase that I see from a high level is sort of managing that change, implementing all these things, and doing training, doing communications, doing engagement, workshops, depending on the project, you do different things. And the last stage, which I think is really important from a high level perspective, is reinforcing that change. So you don't just leave when you go live, but you essentially stick around to ensure that the change has been adopted and that you've provided people enough support so that that's become the new normal, right? Because we've often seen that people will move to something else and then, quickly switch back to old habits. It's just human nature. So ensuring that change becomes a habit, it's become part of how they do things now is I think, an important part of change management, which oftentimes, people don't end up sticking around till that time. But I think it's really important to stick around for that.
No, you're absolutely right. And then, as given your experience on all the technology initiatives, where do you think most projects tend to fail? Or is there a dipping point that you've noticed in the change management process on technology initiatives?
I think with technology initiatives, the biggest area that I've seen that I think needs improvement is that there is so much focus on getting the technical build right. Because when you're doing a technology implementation, it's like, oh, the system needs to be integrated, the system needs to be tested. There's a lot of focus on that, but there's not a whole lot of focus on the people side of change, right? Or the people side of the project. And I think that's the biggest problem, is that when we start up a project, we're so focused on requirements gathering, the technical build of it, ensuring that we're communicating with the vendor, we're doing all these things. We don't really put in a lot of effort into doing an audience analysis or into doing a change impact assessment to understand how we're going to take these people from where they're at right now to where we want them to be. And sometimes we don't even define where we want them to be once we implement that technology. And I think those are really, that's a big setback because, just take the example. You might buy the most expensive laptop in in the market, and you can put it on your desk. If you don't use it, it's useless. And it's the same thing with technology implementation. It can be the best technology in the market. You might have put in the best of efforts to ensure that it's integrated with all your systems, all the data is being transferred, all the systems are talking to each other. But if people are not using it properly, or people are not aware of how to use it properly, you're not going to get the return on investment. And I think that's the biggest sort of failure, or the reason why technology implementations fail, is because there's not a lot of focus on adoption and the people side of it.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And then kind of going back into the change impact assessment. So just to set the context, how would you define the role of the change impact assessment within the overall, change management process?
I think that's the key document. For me, at least, that's the driving force. You do it in the beginning. You document how do your people do things currently. And then you look at how do you want them to do things in the future state after you implement this technology. And what's the gap? So unless you understand what that gap looks like, you cannot sort of, define your approach for taking those people from point X to point Y. So I think the change impact assessment for me is at the center of the entire process, because that's what you start with. And that becomes like your, it's like your guiding document for everything else that you do, for deriving when do you communicate, who do you communicate with, what do you tell them, how do you train them, what kind of transition requirements are to be defined, what are the prerequisites for this to work. Everything, you can derive from a change impact assessment. And something we should do in the beginning of a project, I feel like it should be done when you're doing your requirements gathering, when you're still talking about what technology, because that's a good time to sort of assess how does this process work in my organization currently? What are the different roles? Does it mean that there'll be any changes to roles? Does it mean that there's going to be some effects that are beyond this audience group? For example, sometimes there are teams that are impacted beyond your direct end users, and you capture all of that so that as you go along the way, you can sort of upskill people, you can educate them, and you can engage them at the right points to ensure that you're not doing it all like 3 weeks before go live, because that's not ideal to be trying to do that.
No, you're absolutely right. And so I know traditionally when people are working on a change impact assessment, they really look at 3 dimensions, people, process, and technology. Are there any additional dimensions that you believe that people should think about when they're facilitating that particular part of the process?
Yeah, I think the change impact assessment needs to go a little beyond the traditional process, people, technology, framework. It needs to sort of understand, for me to do a current versus future process mapping, and sort of derive who are the people being impacted and how are their roles being impacted. I think that's very important. The other thing that I do with change impact assessment is also derive transition requirements. For example, you can take the same project and apply it to 2 different companies and come up with a completely different approach. And I'll give you an example because that illustrates it better. You take the example of a new travel and expense management system, right? You're implementing it in a company where people currently do everything manually. They go to the accountant, they give them their receipts, they book their own travel, they get reimbursed, right? It's completely manual. For them, the shift to move to a cloud-based system for booking travel and doing their expenses, that's a bigger, much wider gap. And there's a lot of additional things that you need to educate them on. For example, the accountant figures out how those expenses are coded, or where do they go? Do they go to X department? Are they billable? So on and so forth. People are not aware about that, but you need to educate them, because with a system coming into place, you're sort of making it, putting that responsibility onto them to figure out how to code their expenses. Now, take a different example. The same system you can be implementing in a company which is going from a different travel and expense management system to a new one for cost savings, right? They already do a lot of these things. For them, the gap is much, it's a much shorter gap. It's a different journey for them to take them from point X to point Y. And I think that is where doing a change impact assessment and understanding the impact on people, focus on people, it helps. So I think the component that I would add to a change impact assessment is to look at the process, look at the technology, but do a more deeper dive into how people and their roles are going to be impacted by that particular transformation.
Yeah, so that's a great point. When I was at Deloitte, everything is SOW based, right? So you're doing work, but you have, and you were at Accenture, so it's the same thing. So it's the work is SOW based, and then you have deliverables that you have to crank out, right? And oftentimes, as a consultant, you're there working with whoever on your team, but you're just kind of populating stuff into a spreadsheet, and it's really small thinking from the sense of it's your perspective and maybe the team's perspective. Something that I've noticed that works tremendously well and pushes towards adoption is like thinking about facilitating that experience. So now getting the stakeholders in a room and almost doing a workshop, right? And getting really animated and providing that experience. I mean, I'm talking Post-its and everything, and getting the different teams to self-identify, how things need to change, whether it's people, process, technology, structure, whatever dimensions you want to use. But that's something that I've used in the past, and it's been very, very effective. Have you thought about that, or have you taken that approach as well?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, doing a change impact assessment requires a workshop. I think that's the prerequisite to it. You can't do a change impact assessment. Like, I can't go into a project or a company and be like, hey, I'll do a change impact assessment without any input. It just doesn't work like that. I think the change manager needs to be brought onto the table when you're doing the requirement gathering, when you're talking to the vendor. When a lot of times they think, well, this is too technical, you don't need to be here. But it really helps when you create a transparency in a team, right, where the person has the ability to understand your project beyond just what they're doing. If they can see the larger picture, the bigger picture, it really helps. Yeah. And then identifying the right people, because a lot of times, workshops cannot be successful if you don't have the right people in the room. So just getting those right people in the room to understand how do they do this right now, and how do we envision that they're going to do this after we implement this technology. As long as you have those two things, clarified, and that's going to be, when you do your workshop, I think that's where you get a lot of clarity on that. Yeah. And that is what helps do a change impact assessment, which is going to be helpful. Otherwise, it's just a document from one person's perspective, to be honest.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Something that I'm really, really passionate about is oftentimes finding the most experienced, not necessarily the most experienced, but the person who's been with the company the longest, right? The most tenured person. Yeah. Because oftentimes they, especially with technology, right? Like, today it's SAP, right? But back in the 90s or the late 80s, it was PeopleSoft, right? Like they've seen an ERP implementation before. And so it's like something magical happens when you call on the person with the most tenure in the room. They'll come back and say, we did the same thing 10 years ago. And, they really call out some things that people who are new to the organization wouldn't even identify because they wouldn't have that level of experience. So that's really cool. So let's talk about like Waterfall and Agile, right? Mm-hmm. In your opinion, are we facilitating the change impact assessment differently based on Waterfall or Agile, or is it the same thing? What's your perspective on that?
Well, I think with the, Waterfall is a more structured approach, right? It's like you put in things right at the beginning, and you decide what your milestones are, you decide what your requirements are, and then you go from there. So you can create a document, but I still feel you need to update it depending on how your project is going. Agile, I think, is one of those where you have to constantly adjust your, documentation, because you're sort of, it's more of a thing where you're designing it as you go. It's a lot of getting the feedback from your core team, from the people, from the customers, whatnot, depending on, what you're doing. But you're getting all that feedback, and then you're adjusting your system or your process or whatever it is, your requirements, based on that. And you're doing it in increments or in sprints or, whatever terminology you want to use. From my perspective, it means that you need to go back and you need to constantly update your documentation. And you need to have that documentation. You need to have a change impact assessment to sort of understand, how do I do this right now? What are my risks? What are my benefits of implementing this system? And as you're going and doing your testing and you're getting those, the system delivered, the solution delivered to you, you're testing it, and you're like, hey, you know what, this needs to change, or this doesn't work. So you have to go back and update it. So I think from my perspective, that's the difference, is that it's a lot more adjusting your strategy, your approach, your documentation to what is the feedback that you're getting. With Waterfall, it's a little more linear, right? You do your things, and there's not going to be as much adjustment because your requirements are sort of locked in. That's what you're doing, and that's what you're doing.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely a great source document. I was working for an organization where the CFO wanted to audit all of the transformation programs. Mm-hmm. And so they brought in an outside firm, that was like, they were asking for all of these documents, but when it came to change management, they really just wanted to see the change impact assessment, right? Like, mm-hmm. They wanted to make sure that the right requirements were identified, the right conditions to make the project successful was identified. So it's a really, really critical source document. I want to pivot just a little bit because you were highlighting something about kind of your change agent or the business. So, one person doing change management on a project, especially technology, you can't be at multiple places at one time. So can you provide a perspective on how maybe a new practitioner who's supporting a project, right now, how would they go about creating a change agent network?
I think a lot of this is based on building relationships, to be honest, because, a lot of times we throw around this terminology and we keep telling people, you know what, you need to identify these people who are going to own this change from a business perspective. And it doesn't go like that because, people are not going to do things for a John Doe sitting in corporate that they don't know. You send them an email and like, hey, I have identified you as a change agent. Can you do this? It's more of a task. So I think if you want to build a successful change agent network, you need to have relationships with people. And for me, that I think is really important because if you want to engage people, you need to be able to sort of work with them in a fashion where they think that this relationship is mutually beneficial. It's not just you pushing things on their throat and saying, hey, you got to do this because we're doing this initiative and you're the manager or you're the department head. And I personally feel that it takes a while to build that network. It's not something that happens overnight. It's not something that happens in a week, but it's about ensuring that you're cultivating those relationships, you're identifying those people, you are, providing them what they need and not just asking them for what you need. It's a two-way street. And I think that if you hear and listen to the people before you just jump on asking them for things, I think it helps build a lot of trust and it helps them think that you're working with them to sort of ensure that this is a successful implementation for them and not just, pushing out a project and trying to check it on your list and be like, I'm done with this project. So my advice is to focus on building a relationship and always listen to the people around you and not just be the one talking.
No, you're absolutely right. How we spoke a lot about how to do the process and what success looks like. Let's talk about some common mistakes. So what are some common mistakes that people often make when trying to facilitate this portion of the change management process?
You're talking about the change impact assessment?
The change impact assessment.
Yeah, I think the few mistakes that I've seen is sometimes people just do a very high level impact assessment. It just, tells you we're changing this technology from system X to system Y, and it doesn't really list the impact, the risks, the benefits of it, or doesn't really detail out who are the different audiences that are going to be impacted by it. And I think that's a big mistake because if you're doing the common reason why people tell me they can't do a detailed change impact assessment or a detailed, do detailed documentation is because they don't have time, they don't have budget, which is a fair point. And, some projects don't require a detailed impact assessment because they're much smaller in scope, they're impacting 5 people. But if you have a project that's, mid-level or a large-scale transformation, which has multiple audience groups, which is spanning across geographies, or which has like hundreds of people, or even just 100 people, if you put in that effort to do that impact assessment and put in that detail there, 5 months down the line, I can bet my life on that. You're going to be thankful for putting in that detail there, because people forget, as you're going around.
They do.
It's like, oh, what did we discuss? How did people do it? People in APAC do this differently than people in US. It's not documented anywhere and it gets lost. And then you go live and you realize, well, we missed it. But if you put in that effort to detail it out, I think it really helps. And I think that's the biggest mistake people make, is they do it for the heck of doing it, and it doesn't really help. It's just useless documentation at that point.
Yeah. How do you go about, what's your recommended approach to go about getting executive alignment? We know what's important, and I think you hit on something that's so critical, because sometimes everyone's busy, right? And for executives, they're probably accountable or responsible for several big initiatives at one time. And so as a change practitioner, we know it's important to get their alignment, so that they understand the content that's in the change impact assessment, that they agree to it and things of that nature. But what's your approach to get that consensus, that alignment with executives?
Well, I think it's really important to have a strong sponsor on your project. The 4 things that I see as the pillars of a project is it's a good project manager, a good change manager, a good sponsor, and then you need good subject matter experts, or good people from business who have enough knowledge about your process. If you have a strong enough sponsor, I think that helps you get executive alignment, because if you have a person who's completely engaged, who's 100% dedicated to the project under them, they can influence a lot of the people who are executives or who are C-level executives to get that kind of drive and push that down. And I think that really helps, because, at the end of the day, the one thing that at least I've seen in my career is that if you have a project without strong sponsorship, where the sponsor is not invested and the sponsor, him or herself, is in doubt about the project, it's not a strong project. It's not, you can't get executive alignment on that project. So you do need people on that project. And I think that's a good way of getting executive alignment. And the other thing is that something I've done is do a presentation early on in the project talking about your change management strategy, your communication strategy. A lot of times people don't realize that communication is really important to high-level executives, because they don't want people to come back and say that this was a horrible project, this was a disaster. And they don't want projects to fail, because at the end of the day, if a project fails, it does reflect badly on the executive leadership. So doing that early on engagement with the executives, with your sponsors, and having them push that down right in the beginning to set expectations, I think that helps you get a lot of executive alignment right in the beginning, instead of trying to do it when you start seeing problems, because then it's more going on the defensive, and I don't think that helps. Yeah.
So I want to take it up a notch, because this is a very kind of real reality that a lot of companies are in right now. So, this entire conversation, we've been talking about the change impact assessment at a project level. But what happens when, Yamini, you have a portion of the business that are they're going through maybe 3 to 5 or 7, major changes? What's your recommended approach on kind of facilitating a change impact assessment for a business unit or parts of the organization that are being impacted roughly around the same time by the same types of projects?
So the one thing that I've done is create a heat map right in the beginning of the year. And the one sort of disclaimer I want to put out there is that doing something like this requires centralization in organizations. Right? It requires you to have the ability to reach out to these different departments and understand what is their portfolio of projects for the year. And then doing a very high-level heat map. And what a heat map is, it's essentially, I do it in Excel, to be honest. I do a very simple heat map. I say, these are my departments, these are my quarters, these are the projects we're implementing, which are impacting these people. And then I just sort of, depending on the number of projects, I'll sort of show a yellow, green, or a red sort of a, status, which means that in Q1, this particular team is being hit by 3 different projects, and all 3 different projects are high impact. So I'll say, well, we need to move one of these projects. And honestly, in last year, I did something like that. We had 2 projects clashing, hitting the same people at the same time, and I was able to convince one of them to move and to delay their project by a month, so that we were not sort of causing what I call change fatigue. You don't want the same people to be like, you know what, this is too much. You just want me to attend training and read your emails and constantly change. And it's just, you need to keep that in mind. So I think a heat map right in the beginning, do it by quarter, do it by your department, do it by geography, whatever works for you. But just sort of identify where is it starting to get, like really too many projects. Anyone being hit by more than 3 projects in a quarter, more than 2 to 3 projects is really, it's not a great situation to be in my perspective.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, because you got to remember, like, everyone has full-time jobs, right? So like they're associated with these projects, but they still have a full-time job to maintain. I think your guidance is spot on, because if you're taking a proactive look at change impacts across the business, then you can almost back into how these different parts of the business need to be supported, right? And so, for example, you can now go back to learning and development and say, hey, here's what we're seeing over the next 6 months, right? So now that department can get involved, and different other, levers across the organization can get engaged in a much more proactive way, right? So that you can put the right conditions in place to have overall adoption. So no, I love that. I love that. So Yamini, I'm not going to take up too much more of your time. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me to talk about how to make projects impactful. For those of you who are on the line, thank you for taking time out of your day as well.